Do you remember the first time you met Richard Nixon or President Nixon?
I remember the first time I met him in Washington. I think I actually was invited to an event when he was on the road and attended the event, but didn't actually meet him. My first meeting with him was here, and my first meeting with him was in a group on New Federalism, a group of the staff, and I was immediately impressed with his grasp of the subject and with his knowledge of what was being done by the Johnson administration. And what was being done by the Johnson administration was so transparent to me. It was such a political ploy to get the governors to appoint people to jobs that would be jobs with a term of 10 years or 15 years, and given tremendous powers, power to issue revenue bonds, power to do all the funding they wanted to with the federal government through grants, and yet never have to worry about the electorate, never have to stand for election. So there was this whole new unelected level of government being created, and it would have made elections irrelevant. And Nixon saw that, and saw it had to be trumped. And the only way to trump it is to figure out a way to create a pipeline back to the governors and the mayors and the county officials. And I can't say that it was his idea, but I can say that we did it, and we couldn't have done it without his blessing. But those first revenue sharing checks that went out went directly to the governors and directly to the mayors and the county officials. Jack Williams in Arizona got the check, and that kept the promise.
I think of you and the Congressional Relations Office, the Bill Timmons operation, as where the rubber met the road. The rubber of the policy that was evolved to the road of actually getting it enacted and working. What were the challenges, coming in with the Congress the first time since 1848, that both houses of the federal Congress, of course it's different than states. What was the setup in the states in terms of the Nixon, of selling the Nixon legislative program?
The strategy at first was unclear, but we then focused immediately upon people like Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. We didn't particularly like or have the support of the senators from Arkansas or Mississippi or California, and certainly not New York. But by getting, and we had great difficulty getting the support of even the Republican governors like Rockefeller. Rockefeller and Reagan were not going to support revenue sharing. Dick Nathan worked for Rocky, and he can tell you that Rockefeller said no. But Rockefeller did say yes when Nixon asked me to go meet with Rockefeller. I did. Having met with him, he agreed to not oppose revenue sharing. But we couldn't say his name in the same breath with Ronald Reagan. We couldn't make him the poster child for revenue sharing. But he said, listen, you can use me as long as you don't expose me to unwanted publicity, and I'll help you. And the first thing he did was host a dinner for the Republican governors in New York. A dinner I'll never forget. Right? It was top of the Rainbow Room. Had a entertainer before dinner, entertainer after dinner. Ronald Reagan was there. I sat at the table with Ronald Reagan. There were 13 Republican governors. There was an old-time comedian, Joey Lewis, who who was a Rockefeller favorite, and Joey Lewis did the beginning. And in the beginning he said, "This is a party for my friend Nelson Rockefeller, born into this world just like you and I, naked as a jaybird. Didn't have a thing to his name. And when he was about 3 years old, his father gave him some blocks, just like your father gave you some blocks. Only difference is the blocks he gave him were 51st Street, 52nd Street, 53rd Street. And people roared, Nelson Rockefeller roared. He was in great form. And he agreed on that joyous occasion to support the legislative program, but not if we couldn't photograph he and Reagan together. Even though Rocky was sitting here, Reagan was sitting here. They were in the same room. They were both in agreement that they could be used as advocates or used. We could tell the world that they were supporters, but we couldn't put them out there together. But congressional delegations from places like Arkansas, you heard the Wilbur Mills story. The Wilbur Mills story was real. Wilbur Mills in Ways and Means was a real roadblock.
Tell the Wilbur Mills, because people may not have seen this, so can you tell the Wilbur Mills story in this answer?
Well, Wilbur Mills was not going to permit the legislation to go to the floor without the possibility of amendment. He wanted to be able to amend it to death, Christmas tree the hell out of it, and hang every kind of a bauble and bead on it you can imagine, and probably a bunch of skunk oil. And so if he could load up revenue sharing legislation with skunk oil, he could kill it. And that was the fear. But we were able to get Southern governors. Well, first of all, Wilbur Mills stumbled and chased that broad into the pond. And when he, Fanny Fox or whatever her name was, became his undoing, he then really couldn't any longer be a threat, and he lost a lot of his political clout. So we got lucky with Wilbur Mills in terms of him getting himself in trouble and creating his own political demise. But at the same time, we built bridges to Bill Clinton and built bridges to Dale Bumpers and to other people in the South that enabled us to get those Southern senators to support. Even George Wallace. In '68, George Wallace carried 5 states, running as an independent. He was perceived by Richard Nixon to be a real problem, because if George Wallace had carried 5 states in '68, how many was he going to carry the next time? And there was a Southern strategy, but the Southern strategy was a whole lot tougher to make if George Wallace was out there capturing Southern states. So there's an assassination attempt. George Wallace was shot. But we had really established a great relationship with George Wallace. Every time George Wallace came to Washington, he called me in advance and said, "Jim, I want you to come out to the airport and meet me." We parked his airplane at National Airport in Hangar 1, which was where the Secretary of Transportation's airplane was. And George Wallace parked his airplane there. I'd go out to the airplane. They'd bring him off the airplane in his wheelchair, put him in the car. We'd talk for 10 or 15 minutes. Then we'd come downtown, and George Wallace never said a bad word about Richard Nixon. But the rest of the Arkansas delegation was blocking everything we wanted to do until we really established a relationship with Wallace. And it was building coalitions like that were totally, we never could talk about. We couldn't talk about the relationship we built with Reagan. First, Reagan would have denied it, And secondly, it would have blown the benefit. But by getting the support of people like that, and then by the natural progression with people like Pete Wilson becoming more powerful, Pete Wilson starting out as mayor of San Diego, becoming governor of California, all of a sudden he's a more visible guy. And things going on, Dick Lugar becoming a senator, Jake Garn becoming a senator. So all of a sudden from a senator in Utah, or from a mayor in Salt Lake to a senator from Utah, is a big leap forward in terms of ability to help us get those legislative programs through. But Tom Korologos was from Utah, and Tom knew more about Utah politics than anybody I know. And it was just terrific that Jake Garn became a senator. And Tom was already regarded as a senator. So it was then a natural and easy. I could say to Korologos, we now have a real pal. And you'd go see him and get stuff done.
What was Nixon like in dealing with these local state politicians? Was he good at working them, at closing deals?
He scared me a little bit because he didn't like to talk to him on the telephone. And they all wanted to call him all the time. And they couldn't ever get past Rosemary Woods. And they would call the president and get referred to me, and many of them would grudgingly accept that and talk to me. Good, solid guys who really put it all on the line wanted to be able to talk to the president, and he didn't want to talk to them because he was always afraid of some deal that was going to be sought, or some price that was going to be exacted. So he was reluctant in that respect. But I can honestly say that I was one of the few people on the staff that anytime I sent in a request for a meeting with the president, for a governor, for a mayor, for a group of governors, group of mayors, a new coalition meeting, meeting of county officials, it always got magically approved. And people would come around and say to me, how the hell are you getting all these meetings approved? I just sent in the request. And I'd send the request into the staff secretary, and the staff secretary would pass it in through whatever the magical process was. It would come back, you got the 8th of August, or whatever the hell the date is. And it was like that. The most surprising one was, and this was surprising because there was a particularly sensitive meeting with the Republican governors down in Memphis that I'd love to see the transcript of. But we had the meeting in Memphis, and everybody went. Kissinger went. Mel Laird went. Everybody goes to this meeting. All the people from the White House go to the meeting. Ehrlichman goes. During the meeting, Dan Evans says to the president, "Mr. President, actually, I had proposed a resolution and given it to the governors to sign. I wanted their support for the president even during Watergate. And they agreed to support him even during Watergate, and notwithstanding Watergate. But they wanted to ask a question. And the question was, Mr. President, are there any more bombshells? And he said, not that I know of. We got back on Air Force One, came back to Washington. We landed. I got a call from Mel Laird saying, oh shit, there's an 18.5-minute gap in one of the tapes. What are we going to do? we're gonna have to call these governors and tell them we've got another bombshell. Well, by then, I called Governor Evans and said, you know, Governor, there is another bombshell. This 18.5-minute gap is gonna be in the paper tomorrow, and I want you to honestly know we didn't know a thing about it. It was not something, and the president didn't know a thing about it. It was not something that anybody intended to mislead you about. When we asked and you gave your support, it was simply it happened. And Laird and I divided up the list. He called half and I called half. And I was worried as hell because I had received an invitation through Kissinger's staff to put together a bipartisan delegation to go to China. And so I was in the process of picking 6 governors to make a China trip. And I was going to go as the president's representative because Ehrlichman couldn't go. Ehrlichman was having some problem I didn't know about. Cole couldn't go because Cole was filling in for Ehrlichman. So the only other person that could go as the president's representative was yours truly. And the president had signed off on it. I'd gotten an invitation from the Chinese liaison office to pull my 6 governors together and bring them over. And the State Department was doing the briefings, and everybody, I was getting a diplomatic passport, and everything was on the cooker when the 18.5-minute gap hit. And I thought, oh shit, here goes the China trip. We've blown the whole thing. Well, I don't know what happened next in anybody else's sphere of activity, but I know from that point forward, Ken Cole was an absolute peach for me. Ken Cole was totally forthcoming, would tell me anything, was the perfect colleague. John Ehrlichman disappeared, for all intents and purposes, from my sphere of activity. I don't remember ever having another conversation with John at the White House. Now later, the thing that's toughest for me about John is I felt good about it. And after I left government and he left government, he became a client of mine. I represented John in commercial transactions. But never had anything more to do. But every time I made a request of Richard Nixon for an audience with the people I worked with, it was granted. Never got a no. And never got a no even when it was tough to give a yes. Like Memphis was not easy. Go to Memphis and meet with a bunch of Southern governors or a bunch of Republican governors. He'd do it. And he'd do it both willingly and be prepared.
How hands-on, how interested, some observers, historians, say that President Nixon wasn't very interested in domestic affairs.
And I think that's wrong.
That he was so much more interested in foreign affairs that the domestic affairs suffered.
I don't think that's a fair criticism at all. I think the fairest thing one can say is that from the perspective of the media's attention, the Watergate, Vietnam, and the other crises of the world were so sexy that they got all the press attention. And I can admit freely that it was difficult for us to get any real press interest in domestic agendas. It was tough to get anybody to want to talk about in an article revenue sharing. You could get Scotty Reston to write about revenue sharing. You could get David Broder to write about revenue sharing. You could get the National Journal to write about revenue sharing. But to get the Washington Post, it was Watergate time.
Good?
Yeah.
Good.
Did you want to do a question on the legacy of Richard Nixon?
Sure.
Oh, didn't I ask that? I thought I started with that. Did I not?
Question?
don't think-
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Well, you can never have too much. How would you, yeah, this is sort of a generic question. How would you define the Nixon legacy?
I think the Nixon legacy ought to be defined as one in which he is seen truly for the brilliance that he demonstrated both in domestic and foreign policy. I think the emphasis that I have seen as a casual observer in many years since government is all on the foreign policy side. And I think that that's unfair because I think his domestic policy impact is so deep and so broad and so great that it's really unfair not to treat it that way. Everything from the stuff we talked about this morning, the creation of EPA, creation of the revenue sharing legislation and the effort to trump that unelected level of government that Johnson was about to create, that the states hated. And that creation of a competitive grant process continues to go on today. I talked about for a moment the stimulus bill of Obama creating this education program for $4.5 billion that is a competition. They're not going to spend $4.5 billion, but that's the amount of money that they've got to spend. And they're going to award peer-reviewed competitive grant applications. Now, 50 states are going to make 50 bids. 1 or 2 are going to get funded. 46 to 48 are going to be losers. The states don't like to invest that much time and effort in creating applications that are going to lose. But I can tell you that there are only going to be a couple of winners. And you know, in airport and airway grants, under the Johnson program, the easy ones and the good ones were the ones made by Tucson or Tampa. Tampa got a new airport. Tucson got a runway extended 50 feet, and the extension of the runway in Tucson enabled us to get the Boeing company to deliver the 737 in Tucson, and we had the most productive, we had the most profitable airport in America, because every time Boeing delivered a 737, it was delivered in Tucson. The Lufthansa crew or the Japan Airlines crew would come and rent motel rooms for a month. They would come and train their pilots there to receive the airplane. They would buy their gas from us. We charged them for touch and goes. Every time the damn thing took off or landed, we charged them for it. We charged them an arm and a leg for gas. We charged them to park. So we made more money on the 737 than anybody else was making on anything in America, and all we needed to do that was an extension of the runway. Well, it was a natural to win that grant competition. We could show an outlandish benefit for a very small expenditure. And Tampa did the same thing with respect to its airport and its connection of those pods with the little Disney World trains. But how many airports made applications that they paid consultants and architects and lawyers and grantsmen to put together that got nothing? There were tons of them. So if you were Tucson, it was great under Johnson. If you were Yuma, Arizona, or Flagstaff, Arizona, it sucked, it was terrible. If you were San Antonio in Texas, it was great. If you were Houston, it was great. If you were Fort Worth, it was terrible. If you were Brownsville, Texas, it was terrible, because you weren't gonna win. They were not gonna be better in the grant process than San Antonio. Nobody in the Midwest was gonna submit a better proposal than Indianapolis. Dick Lugar had pros there. And when you get into the competitive grant business, the cities with the pros, the states with the pros, win every time.
And revenue sharing changed that.
Revenue sharing changed it. Revenue sharing trumped that whole thing.
It's a leveler playing field.
Everything is just distributed by formula now. So you don't have to go through the process of giving your soul to Grants Monet, who may be charging you an outlandish amount of money to put together your application for a grant. Instead of doing that, all you have to do is open the mail. Check is going to come from the Office of Revenue Sharing at Treasury directly to the governor. Put it in the general fund.